You are listening to a monastery podcast. I'm Harley Matthews, and I host this podcast as a space that exists to intersect theology, religious history, and culture, all with a bend toward the heavy. I want to thank you for listening. I encourage you to take the time to share, comment, and like this podcast, and to be notified of future episodes. Hey friends, so let's get into this one. This is a little different than what you're going to see most often in the way that this is going to be part of a project that I did for a class. So I took a class called Pastoral Care and Artistic Approach here at Louisville Seminary during the summer of 24. And it's important that I want to mention that this is based on one class. I am not a chaplain. I am not a spiritual director. And the goal of the class was to really look at and plan for a way to do the work. So, just going to put that out there. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a chaplain. This is me processing some of the material from the class and wanting to have a conversation with you about it. So I look forward to any of my work finding itself in conversations with individuals, groups, communities. I want these themes to grow and develop. The theme is about hardcore and healing, the intersection of the two. Firstly, I think it's super important to acknowledge that the goal, kind of the centering theme here, is that this idea that we must be courageous and walk carefully with those who have been walked upon. You've heard me say it before, and I think part of the dialogue here is that when working with communities that have been harmed, or even communities that cause harm, there's a courage in having a dialogue. There's a courage in having a conversation. There's a courage in attempting healing. And those of us that work in those spaces, we want to make sure that we're being courageous and careful. So some of the things that are important, the audience for this is people that already know some of these terms, right? When I say hardcore, I'm talking about a genre of music. It started in the 80s. It was a response to the hippie movement, the Reagan era, it's a response to suffering. It was an opportunity to really just exist in the world, and in a world that for many places said it didn't exist. It would fuse over the years into all sorts of different ways, and some really interesting spiritual intersections, including spirit-filled hardcore in the Christian scene, Krishna core for Hare Krishna, eco core looking at bands that really focus on environmental issues, feminism, Black liberation, all sorts of ways in which the hardcore scene has seen itself. And then I think the focus for me often is we want to think that the best option when having healing is to talk about the largest possible group of people, the largest scope. So how can we fix said issue in the world with every single person? And what the hardcore scene did, really, in music, in my view, is it localized, it emphasized, and really, really just kind of ignored the mainstream and said we're gonna deal specifically with a local community, and you see that in other social experiences, other religious experiences. So one of the things that for this project that I wanted to be in dialogue with, to be again kind of calling me myself on this, to be really specific, is there was both really liberative experiences in the spirit-filled Christian hardcore scene, and there was major harm done. And I've watched it both in my own circles happen, where you see bands rise up, and you see communities rise up around these themes. And then what often happens? What often happens is heroes show up, people with a lot of influence show up, and they take advantage of that influence. So in no way hear me say that there's not room to be critical of this community, of these communities that you're a part of, that you've been in. But the critical comes also with sort of the contemplative, right? That's monastery podcast. That's one of the things that our goal is at. And so I do have what would be called like an emic bias in this way. I'm in the community, talking about the community. And so I just want to acknowledge that again, kind of what I said in the beginning. I'm an insider in a lot of these communities, and so it's a different thing for me to acknowledge it and look at it than maybe if I was looking at it as an outsider looking in. So that's helpful for me to remember. I remember um, that the the opportunity to be a part of a scene, right? Part of that had to do with the popularity of the music. There wasn't. It was for a period of time in the 2000s. It was really really successful to be a Christian in the punk, metalcore, hardcore scene. And before that, it was obscure. It was strange to look at things and experiences like Cornerstone Festival in Bushnell, Illinois, which, gosh, I'm closer to that area than I've ever been in my life. Um, but then you see other experiences and other things happen where abuse happens, right? Churches kind of form around this like tattooed Jesus sort of idea, and these you see a lot of folks, and I've done work with them, and I'm in some ways one of them, right? That I've there is a uh, there's an ex-evangelical kind of community rising up that's saying like this was what was done and this is the harm that was done, and so how can we look at that? um, so I want to look really in the conversation about catharsis and how do you get things out. I think that in healing spaces and spiritual direction in other places, it's very very easy to consider um, the contemplative and like let's sit, let's be quiet, let's calm ourselves. Let's ask really soft questions. And I mean, I see this in even you know kind of like alternative spaces, right? All of a sudden, um, the expectation is the quiet. And so, what I'm doing with this conversation, what I want to have conversations around, is hardcore and healing. I believe that the inverse should happen. I think that the catharsis, I think the working it out, I think the processing of pain and grief and suffering can happen in the mosh pit. So that's kind of my centering image. And so if you know what a mosh pit is, if you've experienced it, and it might be important here to acknowledge what I'm not talking about, right? I'm not talking about Ozzy Osbourne. I'm not talking about a giant festival where there's thousands and thousands of people and you happen to get caught up in something. I'm talking about a dive bar in the local city you live in with five or six bands showing up. You paid $5, $10 to get in, and everybody either knows the lyrics or is so involved in that specific moment that there's a unity, there's an experience that happens where there is less separation between each person in that room, and there's more unity, all based around um, the experience of that mosh pit. And so, why do I use that? I use that for lots of reasons. I think there's some really interesting work around the value of rage and anger in the process of creation. So again, back to like we're kind of going against the grain of the dialogue that says, oh, you have to be very peaceful, you have to be very calm, you have to be very very slow in your process. Um, Folks like Dr. Sally Bailey, folks in other areas are talking about how really actually pouring out rage, pouring out fear, pouring out that process creates new things. That's the new creation. And if we're dealing with healing, then if what would it be like? And this is kind of the question, right? A centering question about the mosh pit as a forum or as a medium for healing. What if you brought something that you needed to process into the that pit into, and you had this experience of you take a moment before you go to the show, and maybe you don't share it with anybody, right? And you walk into this experience, and you're going to be moving your arms and legs. So there's a very embodiment element of it. And you're going to be smashing into other people. You're going to be singing the same chorus along with 10, 15 people, right? This is an essential part of a hardcore show experience, right? Especially if you know the band, right? At some point, even that space that's so clear at a concert, right, is absolutely negated at a show. There is no separation between the microphone and the hand of the lead singer of the band and the community. Community gathers around the music and understands that. So, what if you brought in a specific question? What if you brought in an experience that you needed to process? And then What if there was a an intentional response afterwards? What if there was the opportunity afterwards to process how that experience helped or didn't help you? So, one of the kind of neat sources here, if you're looking at it from a perspective of comparison, which is always difficult and often not helpful, but for the sake of the conversation, look at Cheryl Townsend Gilk. Um, wrote a phenomenal article around human creativity and the agency and focused their work on the Black church, and talked about W.B. Du Bois and this element of there were three parts of the church experience, of the revival experience. And it was the preacher, it was the music, and it was what was called the frenzy. And this, I think, is a kind of almost a direct call into. I think if W.B. Du Bois was in the 80s and walked into a bar in DC and saw this, really the only replacement of with the band is the preacher. Everything else works. The other two elements completely remain unchanged, and I think that's really interesting. Um, it is a an experience where the frenzy shows up. So take frenzy in this article if you were to read it and replace that with mosh pit. Take the preacher and replace it with band, right? Because there is an obvious these bands that we see, you know, all these chords, all this practice, all this energy built up, and then throwing that out into a group of people and seeing how it lands, right? Gathering with a group of people to see how it works is sort of that sort of way. So there's a an area to a show, and we were talking about it just a second ago, called and it's poorly named. Just gonna put that out there, but it's called Gang Chants, right? And that's when there's intentional parts in a song, intentional parts in the music where everybody gets together and sings the same part. And often that's where you see this sort of translation of the community becomes the singer. There's less separation. Again, it's almost a mystical experience. That's where frenzy comes in. So Gilks brings out of Du Bois, um, Du Bois, this sort of the whole, what constitutes the whole body, where is there less or more separation, and how can that be informative for us and informative for healing? um, there are all sorts of ways of intersecting, and I think really leaning into questions about uh, perhaps what do I need to let go of in the mosh pit, like what's been killing me this week. uh, what does it mean? This is super key. Like, what does it mean that you have a community of people that pick you up and you're totally safe when you fall down? Now, I want to clearly say this. I understand fully that's not always the experience. I've been to shows where these are shows are built around already often already oppressed communities, and in that there's all sorts of inner community violence, right? I've been to shows where neo-Nazis show up and they've had to been kicked out of the show. I've been to shows where people show up just to start shit and start fights. That's not what I'm talking about, because generally speaking, what happens is you're safe to fall. That's an interesting question. That's a question of healing, right? How can you translate that experience into the rest of your life and not just at the show, right? Um, I think of there's a phenomenal post on Brooklyn Vegan, which is a great popular um, blog spot, where the Bouncing Souls were having a concert in their hometown in Jersey, and somebody was in the back of the show. This was years and years and years ago, and now you can go online and look at this, and there's been other experiences of this, but um, they probably made 100, 200 people at the show, and there's someone in a wheelchair, right? There's someone that's disabled in the back, and at some point they're missing out on major parts of it because of just location. And they ask, can I crowd surf? Crowd surfing is when you're completely elevated above the group, and they kind of carry you forward. This is really good language, right? To be carried. And so what they do, they lock the wheels on the chair and they lift this person up, and they walk them all the way. They're carrying these wheels, and they're back and forth, passing it back and forth all the way front person that's wheelchair bound is on the stage. The band freaks out. The lead singer takes the time to really acknowledge, like, this is hardcore. Like, this is what it's about. This is who we are as people. And I think that kind of healing experience, because it was about the person that was in the chair that had that experience, but everybody else, every time that that rubberized wheel was touched by a hand, every time, um, every inch all the way up was this example of you're safe in this place, and you're not going to leave here without having a full experience. So these are some of the things that I think are clear intersections of um, themes of spiritual direction, themes of walking into places with questions, and really rubbing up against uh, this kind of false idea that you have to be quiet and calm and peaceful in order to go through healing or in order to seek the divine. I think um, that is not true. It's not the experience of my life. It's not the experience of many people's lives. So this is my question for you. There's lots to look at. There's lots of questions about ritual. There's lots of these sort of things, but let me know. Let me know what you think about these intersections. There's phenomenal people doing the work already with the intersection of therapy that are therapists. Sarah, who's the hardcore therapist, has a phenomenal podcast. There's things I can't get into in this episode that maybe we'll talk about again. Where does the role of race, gender, class work with this? What if we talked about the Afropunk movement that really features solely and collectively, fully Black and brown bodies and Black and brown voices? Furnace Fest is having its last year in Birmingham, Alabama. What is it like to close out a show? What is it like to grieve the loss of a major event like that is a centering kind of space for people to go where um, they spend time and energy and travel to these places to have these experiences. So reach out to me. You can reach out to me in all the places and spaces that I am. Monastery Podcast, harleydmatthews@gmail.com, monasterypod@gmail.com. Again, I want to thank Dr. Amina McIntyre for having this class and really allowed me to exercise some big questions around the importance of catharsis, the importance of a therapeutic and artistic approach to a scene that gets basically told it's just loud, it's just violent, and it has nothing else to say. And that's not true. So I look forward to the conversation. I look forward to meeting together in the intersections that you think about, that you wonder about, and let's talk about it. You have been listening to a Monastery Podcast. I'm Harley Matthews, and I want to remind you that this space exists to intersect theology, religious history, and culture, all with a bend toward the heavy. Thank you for listening. Take time to share, comment, like this post, and then get involved with future episodes. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your ideas and thoughts for future episodes. If you've got questions, if you've thought of contemplation in a way that intersects with the heavy, let me know. Let's talk about it. The music you're hearing behind the intro, outro of this episode was gifted to us by the band Miriam and unreleased tracks from the album Visitors. So I want to thank them. You can find more about them in the show notes below.